Welcome to Playing Above the Line, where we interview entrepreneurs, business owners, and community activists to get their thoughts and perspectives on leadership. Playing Above the Line is sponsored by Aviso Group, a business consulting and accounting firm focused on preparing clients for the future through innovation and positive growth. Welcome to Playing Above the Line. I'm Alan, your host, and I'm really excited about this episode. Our guest is Lynn Smith, and Lynn is not only a friend, he's my Sunday school teacher. He hired my wife when she started working at Bruton City Schools years and years ago, and so Lynn and I go way back, and so I'm excited to hear what Lynn has to say about leadership. So Lynn, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome, and I appreciate the chance to be here.
Yeah. Well, we were talking off mic, and so you were in education for 39 years.
That's correct.
Most recently, you were the superintendent of Bruton City Schools, retired from that position about 6 years ago. But, I mean, you held that position for years.
Yeah,
right?
24 years. I moved to Bruton, just a little bit of background. I taught a year before I was married in Pensacola, Florida, at a all special education center. My undergraduate degree was in special education. Taught for a year there. Got engaged during that year. Robert and I were dating when I moved down here. Got engaged that year. At the end of that school year, resigned there. Took a job in Tuscaloosa. We were married, and we both lived in Tuscaloosa. That's a good thing if you're married together, you know, that kind of thing. But we lived in Tuscaloosa and started working our master's degree at that time. So we taught in Tuscaloosa for 2 years, completed our master's degree at the same time. And at that time, moved to Bruton in August of 1979. I think we probably finished coursework maybe August of 79, and a week later or something moved to Bruton, maybe not even a week later, but moved to Bruton. And we've been here since 1979. It's been a very good ride for us. Raised 3 children, and now we're on our own and enjoying that time of being on our own. So if anybody's listening that you don't know if you're ever going to get through the child rearing stage, yes, you will get through it, and it's wonderful when you do, you know. So.
Well, and I kind of want to start there, and we can kind of back up and talk about some more things. But at the time you retired from the position as the Bruton City School superintendent, I think you were the longest tenured superintendent in the state. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I always told folks that said more about the community of Bruton than it did about myself. Probably the last, I'll say 6 or 7 years, I was the longest serving superintendent. Of course, at that time, and it's probably still true, I think the average service was 2.5 to 3 years, something like this.
Right, yeah. You
had a tendency to run through them. So it really says a lot about the community of Bruton. Of course, before me, Dale Garner was superintendent. He was superintendent for 26 years. I was superintendent for 24 years. And it says just a lot about the community to tolerate folks, I guess.
Point well taken, I think it does. But it also says a lot about your ability to deal with people and manage people and whatnot. So the community of Bruton notwithstanding, it's a great community, you know, don't get me wrong. But give me a couple of things that you think were keys to your success as far as your leadership style or your ability to just deal with all the stakeholders.
Any success I have really goes back to there were wonderful people around me. And I'm going to give you an example. I remember it was 1998, and I remember that because Alabama, the state legislature passed the Alabama Reading Initiative in 1998. And it was probably January of that year, probably right after Christmas. Some teachers asked me if I'd come to the elementary school and meet with them. And I said I would. I had no idea what they wanted to meet with me about. And they got me in a room. There were about 15 of them. And they surrounded me. Basically, it was not a negative thing, but they kind of surrounded me in a room that wasn't very large. And we sat there, and they said, "We're having difficulty." And these were some very quality teachers, experienced teachers. They knew what they were doing. They'd been doing it for a long time. And they said, "We're struggling right now. We've got children that are in the 2nd grade and the 3rd grade and 4th grade that can't read. And we're trying everything we know, and we're not being very successful, and we need your help." And I listened to that, and I wanted to say, look at you folks. If y'all don't know how to make this work, why are you asking me? But I didn't say that. Yeah. I said, let's find a way to make this happen. Now, this is going to take a lot of work. I respected what they had to say. And about, I don't know, I'm going to say 3 or 4 weeks after that, we received an invitation, just as every school system in the state received an invitation to apply to be part of the Alabama Reading Initiative. It sounded just like what we were looking to do. It was an emphasis on K through 3 reading, and it sounded just like what we wanted to do. We made that application, and we were accepted. And I say this as a compliment to the elementary school. The state superintendent, when we were in some kind of meeting, he says, I saw that you were accepted in the Alabama Reading Initiative, and I can't remember, I think there were 16 schools, individual schools, with Bruton Elementary School being one of them. I saw that y'all were accepted into this. Why did you apply for that? Well, he was meaning that as a compliment. It's what, saying we've got a lot of underperforming, poorly performing schools, and y'all aren't one of them. Why did you apply to this? Well, I said our teachers want to be better than what they're doing right now. They want to meet the needs of those students that they have every day. So they started to do that. Now, let me talk a little bit about change. Change is not comfortable to us, and it doesn't matter if we're in the medical profession, if we're attorneys, if we're accountants, if we're educators, whatever the profession is. It doesn't matter if we're attending church. It doesn't matter what it is. We don't like change, and we're comfortable at what we're doing. And we had a few issues with this as we were starting to move through this, because the Alabama Reading Initiative required some things of us. And some of that was 2 weeks of training where you had to leave family and gather together as a faculty for training during the course of the week. And there was some resistance in that, but we moved through that. And I found this to be true. I'm going to chase a little side rabbit if that's all right. I found this to be true because I think this is part of that leadership question and culture that you have to deal with. It's important not to try to change everyone. It's important to want everybody to change, but not to try to change everyone. And what I mean by that is you're always going to meet resistance. And the tendency is to always deal with those who are negative to change, and you kind of push against those who are negative change. I've found if you supported those who were positive in wanting to do something different to make the change, and those who had come to me, those 15 teachers had come to me, were looking to do something different. And there were probably more. I know there were more, but it was just those 15 that had come. Support them with the resources they need, whether it's training, whether it's actual supplies and equipment, whatever it takes. And so when they did that, now this was 23 years ago that this was going on. I guess it'll be 24 years this summer. When they did that and they went off, the Reading Initiative, in its funding, provided a $50 a day stipend for teachers that they did for $50 a day. Now, teachers are used to working for nothing when it comes down to it in the summer. I mean, really, when in the summertime, doing professional development on their own time, training on their own time, doing those kinds of things. So teachers thought $50, that's a pretty good deal. I mean, that really wasn't, but they didn't know any better kind of thing. Well, our school board said, no, we're going to pay them $100 a day. Now, that still wasn't a whole lot for their time and their expertise, but it made them feel really good about what they're doing. So, but I'll go back to where I was trying to go with this. I recognized that by supporting the ones that wanted to make the change, that wanted to change the culture so that everybody left the elementary school reading, not just those who were really already able to read and the parents were supporting it and that type of thing. But if I supported those folks, the others would have to come on board or decide the environment was so uncomfortable that they would rather do something else. It didn't take me as a superintendent to try to force people to do something. Support those who are wanting to do, you'll get a permanent change. I've learned the hard way by trying to force folks into doing it. They'd do it until I left the room.
Right.
And then they'd do whatever they wanted to do.
Yeah.
The change that we saw became something that was permanent because those teachers saw it was beneficial, saw it was good. And the teachers, we come back, sometimes we think leadership's about, in education, the superintendent, the principal, or whoever. But every one of those teachers is leading in their classrooms.
Sure. Yeah.
And they became really, really good at what they were doing. Probably been doing this reading initiative 5 years. We weren't perfect at it, but our teachers had gotten very good at it. our numbers in our special ed programs had dropped off to a point that we were losing funding because the teachers were saying, well, I've got some children who are very limited and low achieving right now, and I could refer them for special education, but why would I do that? I can do this as well as anybody else. I can do this. I have the skill set to teach these students. So our numbers dropped to a point that Dr. Baxter Baker and I had to go up and explain our situation, why our numbers were so low in special education, and they were dropping. Or funny, we didn't cut anybody. We were able to move people around. Nobody lost any jobs or anything like that. And to explain what was happening. In the bureaucracy of that, it didn't matter. We still lost a bunch of money in it because that didn't work. Now, we had an evaluator come in on the Reading Initiative after 5 years or so. He was from Minnesota. And I was going to say he was an older gentleman, but he's probably about my age right now. But I think he was teaching. He was professor at the University of Minnesota, if I remember correctly. But he had been doing reading his whole career. And he was coming in to evaluate Bruton Elementary School. I don't know if he was doing all 16 in the state of Alabama at that time, or if he was just doing a segment for 3 or 4 or 5 or so, whatever. Well, he came in and he spent probably 4 days, most of a week there in the classrooms watching it, and sat down with me to have a conference at the end. He says, I've been doing this. I've been teaching how to teach reading most of my career. I've been evaluating what folks are doing. The states asked me to set up how to do this kind of thing. I've been in a lot of classrooms, and I would tell you that the teaching at Bruton Elementary School, now he didn't go to Taylor Miller High School, he didn't go to Bruton Middle School. It was just there at the elementary school where we had the Reading Initiative. The teaching at Bruton Elementary School is in the top 5 of what I've seen throughout the entire Northeast and coming south in my, I don't really know, probably 40 years of experience of doing this. That says a lot about the teachers, says a whole lot about the principals as far as building that leadership component in a desire to want to change and in a desire to want to do better at what they weren't poor at all, but they wanted to do better.
Well, I mean, one of the things you said that just resonated with me was the fact that I think as leaders, a lot of times we spend more time concentrating and more energy on the people who are resisting than we do the people who are really enthusiastic and just what you're saying. I mean, concentrate on those that are really fired up about it, and man, you'll go all kind of places.
You're exactly right. And it doesn't matter, once again, if we're talking community projects, if we're talking church, if we're talking hospitals, medical fields, it really doesn't matter what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. If we promote those who are positive, because we found this to be true. It took 2 or 3 years. Those who were opposed to change and were negative and were vocally negative about it were all on board because they saw they were so drastically outnumbered by the other folks. Now, I'll also say in this time of change, when I started out in education, there were no computers. We hadn't got, that may be hard for y'all to understand, but there was Wozniak and Jobs, and, they hadn't come around yet to do Apple or to do anything where, and not that there weren't computers, but nothing that you could
a personal computer, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. That type of thing. With the technology change, I also found this to be true. We had a lot of good teachers, many of them a little bit older, that taught children, that engaged children, taught children. They really were not very good with technology, really didn't care for technology. Why would you put technology all in their classroom when they didn't care for it? So when we started increasing technology back in the day in the classrooms, we did it for those teachers who wanted it, who had already been exposed maybe at the university level. That means usually it was the younger teachers. Right. They'd been exposed. They'd seen some things. And we let them become the teachers and the mentors for those other teachers who said, oh, look at what you're doing. I heard my students talking about that. Can you teach me how to do that? We would equip every classroom, but we didn't equip those who didn't want it. If you didn't want it, it was a waste. Now, that wasn't a reflection on those teachers. Their skill set, we had math teachers that could teach it with a piece of chalk and a chalkboard and were wonderful at that. So I'm not saying that they were poor at what they were doing. You have to meet the needs of where they are, recognizing that as far as a leader also recognizing. Yeah. And it doesn't have to all be your way as the leader. There's other ways to do it, and other ways to do it well also.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the word mentor. I feel like you subscribe to the theory that whether it's formal or informal or whatever, it's important to have people that have influence on you, right? I mean, and it doesn't necessarily have to be someone in education for an educator.
That's right. And people maybe that you're pretty close with, but also people that you're just able to read their works. Mm-hmm. An author that's writing about certain things that you're able to do. I found in education, and I don't know if this is probably true in other fields, but in education, it's difficult to do some of that type of training because when you pull the folks out, and I'm not saying you don't ever do that, but when you pull them out, you might provide substitutes in the classroom for 2 hours, 3 hours, or whatever, and the teachers provided some type of activity, but typically you're just not able to do what the teacher was able to do. So it becomes limited in what some of that mentoring there. Best case scenario, you wish that we had the type of funding, and I don't know if any place has this, but it would be nice in this type of funding. Maybe you've got 3 new teachers and that you put them in a couple of grade levels and you disperse them in your school to be able to have somebody that you consider a master teacher or somebody who wants to mentor, and you release them from the classroom for that year, for the first semester of the school year, whatever it is, mm-hmm. to be able to demonstrate to the teachers, for them to watch, them to critique, them to see what was good, what could have even been improved by the master teacher, how they could still improve, but for them to see on a daily, maybe weekly basis, you could see that, right. And that mentor be able to sit down with them and talk with them through issues that we're having. Yeah. It would work extremely well, but you just don't have the funding. I'm going to go back to the reading initiative. It's something I saw at the elementary school too. It was kind of regarding that same kind of thing. As those teachers met, they had to give up a planning period. I can't remember if it was every other week or if it maybe started out weekly, but they met and discussed what their issues were. As they got more into this and shared with this, they opened up and they would say, I've got a student that's doing this, and I've tried this and I've tried this. I don't know what to do. That's hard to say. You're a professional. That's hard to say. I don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. But they would say, I need help. Can anybody see this? Or I'll let somebody come in and teach my class. Let me go teach yours, and you see what this child is doing if you like to, and to be able to give me some ideas about this. But they became unafraid to say, I need help. And they would say this to their peers that were teaching in that same grade level, or maybe a grade level up or down. And somebody else would say, oh yeah, I had a similar kind of problem, and I tried this and tried this. I've already got the lesson plan for this, or I've got the materials made. I'm happy to share that with you. Whereas before, we were trying to see how could we move that student maybe to somebody else or out of my room so I didn't have to deal with it. Right. So that's one of those things that you see when you increase that leadership responsibility. As educators, those teachers become the leaders. They start looking for solutions that if I suggested it before, folks said, oh, that ain't going to work. There's no way that's going to work. But they were unafraid before their peers to say that they needed help. It was a wonderful situation to see.
Yeah, that's a great story. I want to kind of switch gears, and I've never really talked about this personally, but it just hit me. I'm curious. So fans of the University of Alabama will recognize the name Hootie Ingram. He was a longtime athletic director at the University of Alabama. Happens to be your father-in-law, right? So Robin's dad.
Right.
You had a high-stress position as a superintendent of a city school system. Lord knows he did, as being the athletic director for a major college football program. What did you learn by watching him navigate those waters of all the things that someone in that position has to worry about, boosters and coaches and, fans and all the things?
Yeah. First off, remember, Robert and I were married in 77. Had to stop and think that's a little bit embarrassing. In 77. But I know this summer it's 45 years. So that gives me an excuse, kind of thing. It's been, I forget a lot more than that nowadays. But so in 77, and her dad he'd been in Birmingham as a SEC associate commissioner, and he had just moved to Florida State as the athletic director down there. So as we went, all we ever saw were the good things. We showed up at the ball games. We showed up at the bowl trips, and then after that in 77, we went to the University of Alabama. After about 9 or 10 years of that, I think it was in 88, I may be off a year, but he went to the University of Alabama, which is where he played and graduated from, and he grew up in Tuscaloosa also. So he was kind of going back home, and we got to go back and enjoy that and see that. But one of the things I saw, you can imagine at a university level, he was athletic director in a powerful position in charge of all the programs, all the athletic programs at the University of Alabama. But he was also constantly dealing with a lot of powerful people from around the United States whose home was Alabama and wanted to have their voice in that and having to deal with that. That's the harder part of that kind of job of doing your job while listening to others and recognizing they may have a good suggestion, but a lot of times maybe it's self-promoting. I did see that as far as the difficulty in dealing with people.
Sounds like being a school superintendent to me. I mean,
well, I'll say this, and I'm 6 years removed from it. In that 24 years of superintendent, we had 15 years without any turnover in the school board. And that's a true blessing because I'm really not much of a politician. I'm not very good at that. Maybe if I'd ever wanted to develop it, maybe, but I never had that desire to do that. But I had a school board that was very positive. I'm going to tell you, I know I made mistakes during that 24 years, but they allowed me to make mistakes and to go back and make them right after I'd made that, but they allowed that. Did they give individual suggestions? Did I know where they stood as a 5-person school board? Yes, I did, but they did not intervene in the day-to-day. And even more difficult, you would think this would never happen, but in a small town like Bruton, small city school system, come up and say, hey, I've got a nephew moving back to town, can you hire them? That never happened for me.
That is hard to believe.
Yeah, it truly is, to not try to put themselves there to say, hey, can you help me out and do this? Just didn't do that. And we may have made some mistakes along the way. And sometimes it was hard to hire folks. And I know your wife, Madeline, sees this now. Just don't have as many folks in education, don't have a lot of choices when there's an opening. But we always tried to hire the best person. What you think in this interview process is the best person. And as time went by, we also ended up with not having as many to choose from. You like to have selection. You try to match people up in certain spots, and it gets more difficult in education now because you just don't have the numbers of folks that are there.
Yeah, that's great insight. As we start to wrap up, I want to ask you to expand on this because I thought this was a great statement. We gave you a show primer and just asked you to jot some thoughts down, but one of the things you said is leadership becomes most effective when the results are about empowering others. I think that's just a great synopsis of what leadership is and should be. So just talk a little bit about that and how maybe that ideal formed in your mind.
Leadership has changed. Well, it's probably always constantly changing, but if you go back, especially World War II, 40s and 50s, the types of leaders that you had there were folks who stood up and commandeered, people who stood up and shouted out orders, and folks did that. It began to change, I think, in the 60s and 70s, the move, and I think leadership continues to change, but maybe even a good example of this, if you watch, I don't really watch professional football, but the college football, when you go back and look at some of those folks who were successful in the 50s, 60s, maybe even the 70s, their style was much different than what you see the college football coaches, what they do, even the assistant coaches, as they develop people and as they develop players. They had a different style. So even then, the style that you had then is different than what you have now. And if you try to do it all on your own without bringing people in to be a part of this, I said earlier, they may do it for a little bit because they're fearful. Mm-hmm. They won't do it for very long. As soon as you leave, they'll go right back to what they're doing and say, what does that idiot know about this? This is the dumbest suggestion I ever heard, but you won't have a long-lasting change. Yeah. Empowering people brings about long-lasting change. one of my favorite authors in the leadership, and there's several that's out there, but John Maxwell has written, I really don't know how many books. I've probably read half a dozen, and I think he's probably written another 6 or 10 or something on leadership specifically that he's done that. And I would take those things that I'd read and I would share them with, sometimes I would do it in a synopsis type of thing. Instead of giving them a 300-page book, I would give summary statements and things as I would go through and mark. I'd share it with school board members, and I'd especially share it with the principals there at the schools about certain things. It would be nice to say, sit and read this book and let's talk about it. As educators, they don't have time to sit and read that book.
Right,
you know, Now, you may be able to give them a podcast and say, hey, when you're riding to that next student activity that you're going to or something, see if you can listen to this for 30 minutes and we'll do something. But as much as many of them do love to read, they just don't have the time because it's very demanding. But to be able to take some of those statements and to share with them what people are saying as far as impacting your leadership.
That's great. That's great. Last question. This is kind of self-serving, but my son is graduating in May from Auburn with a degree in English education, and so I've got him in mind as I ask this question. But what is the one piece of advice that you would give a new teacher entering the education system now as far as the Lynn Smith's key to being successful or being effective and whatnot?
There was some research done by probably graduate students actually, but the tenured professors got the credit for them. There were 3 or 4 of them. And this was back in the 80s, and you may say this thing is so outdated that it's not effective. I shared this probably when we did Teacher Institute, that first day when teachers are back, and that was really about the only time I had everybody together to talk to them and try to provide a little bit of vision. And I'd hate to guess how many times I shared this in my opening letter back to them, as well as when I stood and talked to them. But these education researchers determined that there were 3 important things to be successful as a teacher and to create students who are learning. The first one, and we kind of assume this because, you come out with a college degree, but the first one is to have a knowledge base of your subject area. Now, I think y'all would also know as you get through, you just think you're prepared when you get through after your 4 years of school that you're prepared to do anything, and you know that there's a lot of learning to come. But to have a knowledge base and to continue growing in it, I probably ought to add that. But that's the first thing that I would tell folks. The second thing is to have a passion for your subject area. And that passion has to include the students. It's not that you're just teaching math or teaching history or teaching English. You're teaching students to have a passion for them and a passion for what you're doing, to think that what you're doing is critical for the students. It's very important for their livelihood, for their success later, even if they're 6 years old, for their success as an adult, and even as far as career choices and that type of thing. To have a passion for that, I would tell folks at that institute, folks, if there's anyone in here that thinks that what they're doing is not important, you need to come talk to me, and I'll either need to convince you, it may be my fault that I haven't convinced you that we think it's very important, or you need to find something else to do. Life's too short. You don't want to do something that's not important. So as a beginning teacher, to have the background, have the knowledge background, to be passionate about it and know it's important in the lives of others. And the third thing is to create a buy-in for students. And by that, it really doesn't matter what all you do if the students don't buy into it. And so that means that I've got to sell it. We're selling a product. That product may be yourself that you're selling, and it may be the subject area that you're selling, but we're selling a product. And if you can become excited about that, the students, sometimes some are going to take a little longer. I realize everybody's a little different, but the students will begin to buy into that. But you can have wonderful lesson plans. You can do a great job of changing activities, making transitions, and doing all that. But if the students don't see how relative it is to them and how important it is to their life, very little learning is going to take place. So you have to have the buy-in, and you've got to sell them on how important that is. 3 things that I've carried through, and I would say for those new folks to recognize that. Learn and to keep learning, be passionate about it, and sell what you're doing to those students in your classroom.
That's great. And I framed that question in relation to education, but I would dare say that what you just said would apply to most any advocation out there. So,
I would totally agree. The concepts are very similar. It's about working with people. Unless you're in some type of a research cubicle and never talk to anybody, it's about working with people. And so I'm in full agreement with that.
That's great. Lynn, this has been great. Thank you very much.
Certainly appreciate the invite.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you did, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. It definitely helps us in the ratings, and it also makes it easier for other folks to find the podcast. And as always, a big thank you to producer and editor Carrie Wolf. Playing Above the Line is sponsored by Aviso Group. If you want to know more about who we are and what we do, you can visit our website at avisogroup.com. That's AVIZO group.com. You can also check us out on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thanks for listening.